Well, this is the Q&A podcast, and I'm your host, Peter Slen. Thanks for joining us. Starting shortly is our conversation with Teasel Muir-Harmony of the Air and Space Museum, and it's on the history of U.S. spaceflight. Our conversation begins in a moment. When the Sputnik satellite was launched by the Soviet Union in 1957, the space race began. Dwight Eisenhower founded NASA the next year, and JFK launched a program to land men on the moon by 1970. The Apollo curator at the Air and Space Museum, Teasel Muir-Harmony, details the arc of the U.S. space program, from Mercury to Gemini to Apollo, John Glenn and Neil Armstrong, and later on, Skylab and the Space Shuttle. Our look at the U.S. space program begins now. Well, today we are joined by Teasel Muir-Harmony to take us through the history of the early space program, all the way through Spacelab, the Space Shuttle program, and up to the current day and the Artemis project. Well, it was October 4th, 1957, Teasel Muir-Harmony, that the Soviet Union launched a satellite into space. It was Sputnik. We could hear the beeps. What was the reaction of the American government and the American people?
So the initial reaction was somewhat mixed, actually. So there was some knowledge that this was going to happen relatively soon. It didn't come as a huge surprise to many scientists or people working within the U.S. government. The general public was a bit more surprised, but you really have to look to a whole variety of different reactions. One of my favorite responses to it, a Democratic aide said that it was like drunkards heard a cork pop. They were so excited. So the Democratic Party really used this as an opportunity to criticize the Eisenhower administration and emphasize the United States was behind the Soviet Union in space exploration, but also when it came to missile defense as well. Eisenhower's response was slightly different. He had already left for Gettysburg for the weekend, so this was a Friday night. He was planning on golfing, a more relaxed weekend. He knew that the Soviet Union was going to launch a satellite at some point. He was a little less concerned. He really tried to downplay everything, but at the same time, Lyndon Johnson was emphasizing that he was comparing it to Pearl Harbor. He was really
He was a majority leader in the Senate at the time.
Exactly. And he saw this as an opportunity to have perhaps even contribute to his ability to run for president soon. So for him, a lot of it was about politics. Johnson saw the opportunity. He ended up leading the Senate investigation. But he really leaned into a narrative that this meant the United States was behind. This was a huge issue for the Cold War competition with the Soviet Union. So initially, right after Sputnik, you see a variety of responses. And the news came to Washington. I love this story. At the Soviet embassy, there was a big party, a celebration. And a New York Times journalist got a call about the news of Sputnik being launched. And there, everyone celebrated. The vodka started pouring. They played set up a radio in the room and listened to it. So there was a big celebration here in Washington for the scientists and the people involved in the space program. Sputnik was part of a larger scientific international project called the International Geophysical Year. So the United States, the Soviet Union, and over 60 countries around the world were part of this project. Satellites were going to help us learn more about the Earth. So it was announced years earlier. The satellite programs were announced in '55. The United States was working on a satellite. The Soviet Union was working on a satellite. This was part of scientific research about Earth. And so there was some knowledge that this was going to happen, and for many people it was exciting, but then for other people it was really concerning because there was this sense that if the Soviet Union could launch a satellite into space, it could launch a nuclear weapon, and then it could really put the United States, increase the threat of nuclear wars.
Well, this happened in 1957. There were still 3 years left in the Eisenhower administration. When did NASA come about?
Relatively quickly. So there was a big Senate investigation led by Lyndon Johnson, a lot of work done in the spring of 1958. The first American satellite was launched in January of 1958, so that success finally happened after a failure in December of 57. But by the summer of 1958, there was the decision to establish NASA, the decision to make civilian and military space separate entities within the United States. This is a bit different than the Soviet Union, but it was seen as it was going to be a priority to establish a civilian space agency. And so they went ahead with the signing of the Space Act, which established NASA, and by the fall of 1958, you have NASA.
So were satellites being launched regularly after Sputnik?
Yes, relatively regularly. You had Sputnik launched in October of 1957. Just a month later, you have the Soviet Union launching a satellite with a dog on board, Laika. And so you have this ramping up of satellites being launched, and then both the United States and the Soviet Union establishing human spaceflight programs, and a lot of missions launched in preparation for those flights as well.
Teasel Muir-Harmony, who are some of the early figures in the U.S. space program? Names that we should know.
Sure. A really key name is Wernher von Braun, a fascinating figure. He was born...
The former Nazi.
The former Nazi and SS officer, exactly. And so it's interesting because sometimes he's known as the father of American rocketry, but also of German rocketry as well. And you could even give him a lot of credit for starting the space age and space exploration. So he helped develop the V2, Vengeance Weapon 2.
Which was a Nazi rocket, correct?
Exactly. And he played a really key role in how established Nazi Germany was when it came to rocketry and missile development. He really was quite capable when it came to ICBMs. And their development. And the V2 was the first craft to actually leave the atmosphere. So really started the space age, some would argue, in the 1940s. Now, near the end of World War II, he knew that Germany was going to lose the war, and so he positioned himself and many of his engineers and documents and things related to his V2 program in a place where the United States could capture him, because he decided he would prefer to go to the United States versus the Soviet Union. And he knew that both the Soviet Union and the United States would be interested in this technology that he was developing. It was some of the most advanced technology in the world at the time. Both the US and the Soviet Union went to look at the V2 technology, but the United States was able to capture most of it and bring all those German engineers to the United States as part of Operation Paperclip. And then this is when von Braun became really critical for US missile development, but then promoted interest in spaceflight and space exploration, even working with Walt Disney to get people really excited about spaceflight in the 1950s. And then he goes on to be a really critical key player in the Apollo program, recommending that Kennedy send humans to the moon and return them safely back to Earth, making it clear that this was something that was technically feasible. He was a really good voice when it came to that.
How did you start your study of space?
Well, from a very young age, I'd been interested in the history of astronomy, and then I was lucky enough to get an internship after college at the National Air and Space Museum, learning about the history of space exploration, doing archival research, and I loved it. And so I went to graduate school and ended up getting a PhD and looking at the Apollo program in my dissertation. Very, very interested in the politics of space flight and space exploration and how it's really served U.S. diplomacy quite well over the past few decades. So that's been my area of interest, and then I was lucky enough to get the position at the Air and Space Museum.
Was the space race an issue in the 1960 election?
The space race was somewhat of an issue in the election. There was more concern about the missile gap. Kennedy actually wasn't that interested in spaceflight or space exploration. There's a story that he might have even said that he thought, missiles and rockets are just not of interest to him. He wasn't following spaceflight that closely, and it wasn't until he became president and he really fully understood the broader impact of spaceflight and space exploration that he leaned so heavily into the program. But he resisted it for quite some time, actually.
The Mercury program, established under the Eisenhower administration, Gemini, established under Kennedy. What did those two programs accomplish? What did we learn?
So for the Mercury program, it really was a program to see, can humans live in space? One astronaut would fly at a time, and it was really testing the basics of spaceflight and space exploration. There were questions like, can a human eat in space? Will your eyes change shape? Really basic questions. And that program helped answer those. The Gemini program really helped prepare the United States to land humans on the moon. So it was a lot of testing of capabilities. Each of the missions included 2 astronauts, and they were doing things like rendezvous, docking, spacewalking for the first time. They were learning about the effects of long-duration spaceflight on the human body, because they wanted to know what would happen during a 2-week-long mission, which is the longest sort of expected mission for the Apollo program. So 2 weeks, what happens to the human body? So they did all these tests in low Earth orbit. Before then, they moved on to the next stage, which was the Apollo program.
And what were the Soviets doing during this time?
So initially, the Soviet Union was also sending 1 human into space during the United States sending 1 human into space for the Mercury program. So the Soviet Union achieved the first human space flight with Yuri Gagarin's flight in April of 1961. It was an orbital flight. Made headlines around the world, and sort of my favorite sort of accounting of this flight was that, Sputnik shocked the world. People were surprised that Sputnik happened in many places. The Gagarin flight impressed people. So it really suggested to people around the world that the Soviet Union was advanced scientific and technologically, that perhaps other countries should align with the Soviet Union. So it had a very big impact internationally, and then also to President Kennedy and how he wanted to strategize in response. The US had several missions with the Mercury program as well. So you had the first successful American spaceflight on May 5th, 1961 with Alan Shepard. This was a 15-minute suborbital flight, but it really gave President Kennedy the confidence to push forward with the Apollo program. And then subsequent missions, you had orbital flights, more time in space. John Glenn orbited the Earth for the first time for the United States in 1962. But there were real challenges along the way. One of the spacecrafts, when it landed in the ocean, filled with water. So they were dealing with a lot of struggles. This was really a technologically advanced program. They were at the cutting edge. I like to, when I'm at the National Air and Space Museum, I love showing people Alan Shepard's spacecraft, because you really get a visceral sense of where the United States was in 1961 when President Kennedy proposed Project Apollo. There were so many unanswered questions, so much work left to be done, and it gives you a great sense for the ambition of Project Apollo, of sending humans to the moon within a decade.
Were Americans invested, and I don't mean just with taxpayer dollars, but were they invested in the space program during this time?
One thing that's really fascinating about the Apollo program is that I think in retrospect that we expect that people were very excited, and internationally people were. Domestically, there was a lot of questioning about whether or not this should be a national priority, and it's important to point out sort of the level that it was a national priority, the expenditure, the commitment to that program. So it was over 4% of the federal budget by the mid-1960s. Extremely expensive program, and Kennedy really made it a national priority. And so many Americans questioned whether or not this should be a national priority. Should the United States be spending this much? And it wasn't until the Apollo 11 landing mission that over half of Americans thought this was a good idea. Kennedy proposed Project Apollo for diplomacy reasons. It was part of his larger grand strategy in the Cold War. It was to win the hearts and minds of the world public. He's very, very explicit about that when he proposes Project Apollo, that spaceflight was sort of igniting the imagination of minds of men everywhere who are attempting to make a determination of which road they should take.
How aspirational was his 1962 Land a Man on the Moon speech by the end of the decade?
Yeah, that 1962 Rice University speech, I mean, it continues to this day to be one of the most famous speeches in history. It was remarkably stirring. And I think it was very fitting it happened in a sports stadium, because if you look at the full text of the speech, or if you listen to it, the speech really has this sense like a great story. And you can see a coach talking to their team, midway through a game, saying, we're behind, but we're going to win in the end. It has that sense, and he even, if you look at the text of the speech, and I love doing it, you can see in the Kennedy Library they have the speech. He inserts some notes in it, and he talks about, why send humans to the moon, and part of the why send humans to the moon, he included in there, why does Rice play Texas, right? And it was in a direct relationship to, the competition, the need, that it encourages the best of our abilities. It organizes us. It is a great thing to achieve for great things.
But why, some say, the moon? Why choose this as our goal? And they may well ask, why climb the highest mountain? Why, 35 years ago, fly the Atlantic? Why does Rice play Texas? We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win.
Teasel Muir-Harmony, was there any cooperation at this point between the U.S. and the Soviet Union on space?
There was cooperation more or less all along. Kennedy actually, so he proposed Project Apollo in the end of May 1961, and then from there he goes to meet with Khrushchev and in Europe, and he actually proposes that they should go to space together. They should pursue lunar exploration together. So this is really shortly after he proposes Project Apollo. Khrushchev says, we need to deal with arms control before we can talk about cooperating in space. But there were multiple times that Kennedy reached out to Khrushchev to try to go to the moon together. And then also there was, the United States looked for other ways to cooperate with the Soviet Union. So data sharing when it came to weather satellites and things like that. So throughout the space race, there were gestures, especially from the United States, primarily from the United States, to work together, to find a way to decrease international tensions through cooperation, through scientific exchange, through finding ways to come together as opposed to have this competition, which was driving them apart.
The 4-inch flight, 1961, Mercury program, was it public?
It was public. One of the interesting differences between the United States and the Soviet Union and their approaches to spaceflight was that the United States decided to make everything public. So journalists were invited to view the launches. Information was made available ahead of the flights, during the flights, whereas in the Soviet Union, information was shared after the fact. One great example of that is after Yuri Gagarin's successful flight. The announcement was made. He was flown back to Moscow for a large celebration. On the flight, he was given a script to memorize that described his experience of his flight. Within the United States, it actually became part of the larger project because spaceflight was extraordinarily symbolic. It was supposed to, in many ways, represent the values and strengths of a nation. And within the United States, a lot of the people working on the program saw this openness as a demonstration of the benefits of an open democratic society. So embedded in this policy about inviting journalists to come see these launches, showing the failures of the program, that was also supposed to symbolize the strengths of American society, that we're sharing both of our successes and our failures.
So what was the 4-inch flight?
The 4-inch flight was an uncrewed test flight for the Mercury programs. It goes about 4 inches. It explodes on the launch pad, seen as a failure, but also something to learn from and to continue moving forward with the program.
And was it Cape Canaveral? Was Cape Canaveral the spot on the Florida coast at that time?
Yes, and it had been chosen somewhat earlier. It had already been an important site for the U.S. military, so in the Air Force, but seen as a really great place to launch rockets from because you can launch them over the ocean, and you also want to be as close to the equator as possible. So sites in the southern part of the United States were initially explored, but Cape Canaveral was perfect in many ways.
And C-SPAN's Q&A podcast continues in a moment. It was in 1967 that the Apollo program was launched, and we spoke with former Apollo flight director Gene Kranz about Apollo 1 in 1967.
Frank Borman was one of the keys because he was one of the astronauts who looked after the changes to be made in the Apollo spacecraft. And he finally said, okay, we've fixed all the things that need to be fixing. It's time to fly. And we had an incredible leadership from a standpoint of NASA leaders at all levels, down through the working level that I was at. And that was what basically got the program moving. We flew basically the Apollo 7 mission. Was the first flight test of the completed, what we call the Block 2 Command and Service Module. Very successful. We then took, with Apollo 8, we took it to the moon in the second flight test with men in it. And it was really a drive to accomplish safe and successful spaceflight. And I believe it was the momentum built as a result of the fire.
What fire was he referring to?
So he's referring to the fire on the launch pad with the Apollo 1 mission. At that time, it had a different name, but it's a tragedy that killed 3 Apollo astronauts in 1967 and really led to many, many changes for the Apollo program.
Well, Teasel Muir-Harmony, within 2 years of that fire, we were on the moon. That's pretty amazing, isn't it?
And amazing when you think that they halted all crewed flights for 20 months while they did this investigation. When it came to the command module, that was North American Aviation, and there were some really significant challenges or shortcomings that were found there. Some sloppy work. Actually, the Apollo 1 crew, even before this test, they had real concerns about that spacecraft. They called it a lemon. They even took a picture of it with a lemon. It was a very complicated vehicle. There was so much to learn, so much new technology to put inside that spacecraft. So you get over 500 switches and dials. You get something like 20 miles of cables. So a really, really challenging engineering problem. A lot of important changes were made to that spacecraft. And one of the things that NASA had the astronauts do is travel to all these different facilities where the different components of the Apollo program were being created to get to know the engineers so that they'd have a personal connection and so they'd have a personal investment in these astronauts and ensuring that they would be safe. So Apollo 1, often it's remembered as a horrible tragedy, but also was really critical to ensuring the success of all future missions.
Lyndon Johnson, Richard Nixon were the presidents during all of the Apollo launches. Mm-hmm. Were they as supportive of the program as JFK was?
So I would say Johnson was the most important president when it came to early American space exploration. And I say that because he played a very critical role before he was president as well. So in response to Sputnik, he got the United States to really invest in space exploration, was critical to the establishment of NASA early on. Also really concerned about international law and cooperation, and so was really key to the passage of the Outer Space Treaty as well. And then when Kennedy was trying to figure out what the United States should do in response to Gagarin's flight, and then also there was the Bay of Pigs invasion, he went to Johnson, who was the vice president, but also the head of the Space Council. And he said, find me a program that promises dramatic results that we can win. That was his instruction. And then Johnson did the legwork, and he met with James Webb, who's the head of NASA. He met with Robert McNamara. He met with Wernher von Braun. He collected all this information and then came up with this goal of sending humans to the moon, landing them there, and returning them safely back to Earth. And that landing them there, this is a little aside, the decision that it was a landing as opposed to an orbital flight was this idea the Soviet Union would have to create a new rocket if they were going to achieve that goal. And so the US had a better chance of winning if it was a landing mission in particular. And it's worth mentioning that after the Apollo 1 fire, part of the reason that program continued was because of Lyndon Johnson, because he pushed for the Apollo program to continue. He did not want to see it end after that first failure.
When did we first orbit the moon, and was that a real landmark?
The first orbital flight was quite a landmark and just an amazing story overall. So this happened at the end of 1968. This was a very tumultuous year for the entire world, especially for the United States. You have the assassinations of Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy. You have the Tet Offensive in Vietnam, the Democratic National Convention. It's just a year of tumult and divisions and tensions. And the United States was keeping track of what the Soviet Union was doing in space. The CIA was able to pick up on information that the Soviet Union had sent a flight to the moon. Not with humans, but with some animals. So I think not a landing. Not a landing, but had done this circumlunar flight, and the concern was, does that mean there's going to be a human flight in the near future? And that that is a stage towards human flight. That was part of the plan. The Soviet Union was planning on sending humans on this circumlunar flight. And so within the United States, there was real concern because the lunar module was not ready. But what the United States decided to do was sort of leapfrog or change the approach to the Apollo program a little bit. And the question was raised, well, even though the lunar module is not ready, the command module could be ready in time for this lunar orbital flight. So they changed things around and called up Frank Borman, who was the commander of the flight, and he was working at North American Aviation, ensuring the command modules were going to be ready. And they said, we're thinking of moving your flight up, and we're changing the trajectory. It's no longer Earth orbit. We're going to send you to the moon. And it was an incredibly risky challenge to take on. Frank Borman estimated that risk, and he said there's a 1/3 chance it's going to be a success, complete success. 1/3 chance the mission's a failure, but we come home alive. 1/3 chance we do not come home. The crew launched to the moon in December of 1968, and the whole world watched. It was a successful mission, and it really was, you could argue, the end of the space race, because after that achievement, the Soviet Union, it was really hard for them to get to that point, and their program started to slow down a lot after that. But just an unbelievable achievement. For many people, it's their favorite mission.
Speaking of Apollo 8, who were the astronauts?
So you have the commander, who's Frank Borman,
who went on to become president and chairman of Eastern Airlines, didn't he?
Yeah, exactly. And then shortly after his flight, he also served as a liaison in the White House between NASA and President Nixon. Nixon asked him to stay on in the White House. He loved him so much. But Frank Borman wanted to go on and do other things. You also have Jim Lovell, who many people might know from the Apollo 13 mission, but he was also on this flight. Frank and Jim had done a 2-week-long mission in the Gemini program to test long-duration spaceflight. And then you have Bill Anders as well. So the three of them took on this challenge and traveled to the moon.
Well, it was Christmas Eve, 1968. Apollo 8 was in orbit. Here's what Americans heard.
It's now approaching lunar sunrise. And for all the people back on Earth, the crew of Apollo 8 has a message that we would like to send to you. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. And God saw the light, that it was good. And God divided the light from the darkness. And God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And the evening and the morning were the first day. And God said, "Let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters. Let it divide the waters from the waters." And God made the firmament, and divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament. And it was so. And God called the firmament heaven. And the evening and the morning were the second day. God said, "Let the waters under the heaven be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear." And it was so. And God called the dry land earth, and the gathering together of the waters called he seas. And God saw that it was good. And from the crew of Apollo 8, we close with good night, good luck, a Merry Christmas, and God bless all of you on the good earth.
Teasel Muir-Harmony, why did they choose to read from Genesis?
It's a great question, and it's one of my favorite stories from the space program. So Frank Borman was told when he was preparing for this mission, and the schedule was short, he was told, the broadcast will be on Christmas Eve, and more humans will be listening to your voice than have ever listened to a human voice in history. Say something appropriate. Those were the instructions he got, and he thought, what should I say? He didn't think he was the right person to figure that one out. He had certain skills. He knew what his skills were. So he called the science advisor to the U.S. Information Agency, who he had known because they had been on diplomatic tours together. This was Simon Borgen. And Simon Borgen thought about it, and then he reached out to his friends, and then they came up with this idea to read from the Bible and to read Genesis. And why that passage was chosen in particular is because they wanted it to have as much universal appeal as possible. So they didn't want to read something from the Christmas story, even though it was Christmas. They wanted something that would connect with as many people as possible around the world, and they thought that it would have the gravity that the mission deserved and required. And so that was recommended to Frank Borman. He thought it was appropriate and perfect, and he shared it with his crew members, and they brought up that script with them. You can see it on the flight plan. And it had a huge impact of people around the world. For the most part, it was celebrated and appreciated. I think they received 34 letters of complaint. There was one person who challenged it because they thought this didn't represent the separation of church and state. But for the most part, it was seen as a really beautiful moment and reading and a unifying kind of message for people. And you also have the Earthrise image, which was taken, that appeared on newspaper throughout the world, and it really gave people a sense that they're sharing this Earth together, a sense of interconnection, and an appreciation for the planet as well, that we all share this planet together. It was a big part of the messaging. Lyndon Johnson was about to leave office. He was really moved by this mission. He knew other people were as well, so he took that Earthrise image and a message also about the need for peace and global connection, and that this is a shared planet, and he sent that to foreign leaders around the world, and to foreign leaders the United States was not in good diplomatic relations with. So Ho Chi Minh, for instance, and he got a thank you letter from Ho Chi Minh after he was finished being president. It arrived at his ranch. But for Johnson and for many people, this Earthrise image and this mission really got to the core of some of the significance of space exploration, and that what it could teach us about ourselves, and that we do share a planet. Frank Borman, the commander of the mission, he reflected later on, and he talked about he thought that the cameras, that was a waste. You know, when it comes to spaceflight, you want as little weight as possible. So he thought, why are we bringing cameras into space? Why are we bringing the television camera into space? But then he realized later on, he said that was actually the most important equipment because that brought people along with us. And if you think about stories of exploration throughout history, so many of those stories don't include that live coverage. And perhaps today we're more used to it, but back then, to be able to follow along in real time with the flight, it contributed to the entire world stopping what they were doing to follow along live as well. And that contributed to the larger significance of the Apollo program, that it was the whole world stopping what they're doing to participate or follow this flight live together. And that television coverage was part of that.
It was only 7 months after this Christmas Eve broadcast in 1968, July 21st, 1969. You know, I was 9 years old, my brother was 10, my sister was 4. Our parents woke us up late at night to watch TV. Was that a common thing that happened?
I was going to say, you and every single other American. I think
we have a picture of my sister next to the black and white TV. It's fantastic.
I love it, and I love all the stories. One of the great joys I have of being a historian in this era and focused on the Apollo program is I hear people's stories. And whenever I travel internationally, people tell me their stories too, and it's such a pleasure. I think something around 94% of American households had their television sets on. Most of them were watching Walter Cronkite on CBS, but the whole world was watching this flight. This was the first truly live global television broadcast. You had somewhere between 500 and 600 million people watching live. And for many people, this was the first live event they ever saw on television. So the United States really invested quite a lot in that ground infrastructure to allow people to follow that flight live as well. So building up the television capability, and in regions where you couldn't have television, they set up a radio, so invested a lot in live radio coverage in many, many languages. So it was really a global event. But part of what you probably saw watching the television, you were probably watching Walter Cronkite. He was being shown in the White House as well. It was their most elaborate program that they had done. And so they had set up correspondents around the entire world. And part of the coverage, what you would have seen, is coverage of the audience around the world watching the flight. So this real sense that this is something the whole Earth is doing together was baked into that experience of being an American watching that television set. And then people around the world also got that sense as well. So it was funny because the astronauts, after they returned to Earth, they were in quarantine. For the first time, they got to read coverage of the mission. And Buzz Aldrin said to Neil Armstrong, "We missed the whole thing. It looks like there was a party here on Earth," because of it really was a global experience. And so part of what you saw on the television set was people, at all hours of the day, so the entire globe stopping what they were doing to watch this, the first steps on the lunar surface.
Well, let's go back to July 20th, 1969.
Buzz, this is Houston. F2, 1/160th second for shadow photography on the sequence camera.
Okay. At the foot of the ladder, the lamb footbeds are only depressed in the surface about 1 or 2 inches, although the surface appears to be very, very fine-grained as you get close to it. It's almost like a powder. Ground mass is very fine. I'm going to step off the lamb now. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Were those words planned?
I believe Armstrong planned those words, but they were not scripted. They were not something provided by NASA or the White House. It was up to Armstrong what he was going to say, and I think he chose perfectly. He understood his role to be the first person to walk on the lunar surface, and part of the reason he was selected for that role is because of his intelligence, his seriousness, his capabilities. And so it is no surprise he figured out the right things to say. So I think he had planned it, but no one else knew that those were going to be the words he was going to say.
And C-SPAN's Q&A podcast continues in a moment. Ever since 1969, we've gotten to know Buzz Aldrin, the second man on the moon, gregarious. Neil Armstrong was more reticent, right? Did not see him many places at all.
Armstrong was much more reserved than Aldrin. It's interesting, in Mike Collins' wonderful book about the space program, he talks about how they were amiable strangers. So all three of those crew members from Apollo 11 were quite different personalities, but they all respected each other and their capabilities. And they worked well together as a team, but they weren't chatting that much during the flight. All the original audio is available. You can listen to it. And some of the other missions, there's a rapport between the crew members. Apollo 11, they really focused on the mission, and there was they didn't become close friends. And Armstrong was a more reserved person, really capable when it came to some of the diplomatic roles he had to play as an astronaut. So after his Gemini flight, he traveled around South America. He learned phrases in the local languages, really engaged and connected with people. That really impressed leadership at NASA. Incredibly capable pilot. There are so many examples of him making the right decision, no time at all. And what's sort of remarkable also, Apollo 11, the first lunar landing, he landed that lunar module more softly than any of the other Apollo missions. I love pointing out, because the lunar module has crushable legs, so it was designed to handle some impact. Armstrong landed it so softly that those legs didn't really crush, and so he had to jump a bit to get on the lunar surface, which is sort of funny, from the ladder.
Getting back up to that first step, that isn't collapsed too far, but it's adequate to get back up. Roger, we copy. Pretty good little jump.
Aldrin was very hard charging. He got the nickname Dr. Rendezvous in the astronaut corps because he loved orbital dynamics. He had done his PhD at MIT in that area. His work actually contributed to the Apollo program, but even at a party, he couldn't stop talking about it. Like if you were talking to Aldrin in the 60s, he was probably going to be talking about orbital mechanics. So yeah, different personalities, but and Armstrong actually was given the decision, do you think this crew is going to be a good fit? He was going to be the commander. They asked him, and he said, Aldrin is a great pilot, brilliant man. I really respect him. And so even though their personalities were quite different, they did respect each other, and they worked very well together.
How did the astronauts get back from the lunar module back to rendezvous with Michael Collins in Apollo 11?
So the lunar module is a two-part spacecraft, and it lands as one spacecraft, but the top part of it, the ascent stage, launched from the descent stage and then rejoined the command module in lunar orbit.
Was there some trepidation about the efficacy of that, if it was going to work?
There was a lot of innovation necessary in ensuring that those rockets would work in space. They used a special fuel that ignited on contact. So really a lot of very important innovation when it came to the engines that were designed for the lunar module. With Apollo 11, they also had a circuit breaker issue that by accident they had knocked it, and Aldrin thought quickly and was able to save the mission at the end. I mean, they had already done their successful moonwalk, but there was a chance they weren't going to be able to launch with the lunar module. And he used a pen. He had a metal pen, and he jabbed it and bent it into the circuit breaker, and they were able to fly and join Mike Collins orbiting the moon. One of the things I love about the Apollo program is you hear some of these stories about the alarm during the landing of Apollo 11, but the more you dig into it, the more incredible stories and challenges you learn about the astronauts overcoming in each individual mission. It's just a remarkable program with endless stories about, ingenuity and problem solving and teamwork. Apollo was really critical to sort of jump-starting or contributing to the history of computing. So before Apollo, computers were getting larger and larger and larger, filling entire rooms. With the Apollo program, they wanted a computer that could be like 1 cubic foot. It had to fit on board. And that required a lot of research and development, and to try to figure out how to make computers smaller, how to make them extremely reliable. And so what you get is this supercharged sort of investment in computing. And so although the computers that they used to land on the moon really can't compete with our computers today are a result of that investment at the time because of those Apollo computers. So you get people becoming software engineers for the first time, and you get a lot of development of hardware, and then those people then would go on to seed Silicon Valley and contribute to modern day computing.
Well, it was less than a year later, April 11th, 1970, before we leave the Apollo program. We spoke with an Apollo flight director, Gerald Griffin, about that day.
When we started the reentry, there's a period called blackout. So during that blackout, we knew exactly where it was supposed to start, and it started right on the second. And then we knew when it was supposed to end, and when we got to the end, we started calling them, and we got no answer. Nobody said anything. You could heard a pin drop in that control center. We were looking forward. We weren't looking at each other, but we were thinking, good golly, we've gotten all this way, and maybe that heat shield got damaged when the oxygen tank exploded. Wasn't very far away, and maybe they didn't make it. Maybe they didn't make it into the atmosphere. And the Capcom, who was a fellow named the communicator talking to the crew, was Joe Kerwin, and Joe kept calling Apollo 13, this is Houston. And he would do that about every 15 to 30 seconds. Finally, on one of his routine calls, Jack Swigert, who was the command module pilot, said, "Oh, hello, Houston, everything's fine here. How you doing?" And of course, we almost fell down.
Teasel Muir-Harmony, that was couple of tense days there, right?
It was. The Apollo 13 mission really was so intense. It captured so much attention. Nixon was so worried about those astronauts, he was asking for updates every hour. People around the world were following the flight, they were praying, they were getting together and following the mission and expressing concern. Other countries were offering to help. So what ended up happening is an oxygen tank exploded, crippling the spacecraft, leading to so many different issues that the astronauts had to overcome in terms of conserving fuel and oxygen issues. And I could go on and on and on, but it was a very tense flight that required the teamwork of everyone in mission control and on the spacecraft itself, and challenge after challenge arose. And that in that clip, it's talking about even though they got the astronauts, fly by around the moon, headed back to Earth, there was still a question of whether or not they were going to survive re-entry. Could the heat shield have been damaged in the explosion? They didn't know, so there was a whole lot of fear until the last moment. So much so that Flight Director Gene Kranz, who was in mission control at the landing, he was known for wearing a vest, a white vest, because he was part of the white team in mission control, and his wife would sew him these vests. And usually on the landing day, he would put on a celebratory vest, his wife, and there were like these red, white, and blue striped great vests to celebrate. For Apollo 13, they didn't know, they weren't confident this was going to be a success. So he wore that white vest on that landing day to give you a sense of just how worried they were until the very last minute.
Had Apollo run its course by the mid-70s? People losing interest?
So many Americans were losing interest even by Apollo 12, the second landing mission, which happened in November of 1969. Interest internationally remained higher, but it was clear by around 1969 or so that planning had to be undertaken to the follow-on programs, and a real questioning of whether or not the United States should pursue all those Apollo landing programs. So it was supposed to go up through Apollo 20. So the last Apollo mission was Apollo 17. So a number of missions were canceled. And part of that was the sort of interest and attention was starting to wane, that they had served that initial goal of landing humans on the moon, returning them safely back to Earth with Apollo 11. Later missions were really, really important for science, but that was a little bit more difficult to get people like glued to their TV sets to, a few months later learn about lunar geology. So there was a shift, by the early 70s.
How many times did the U.S., and it's still the only country to land men on the moon, how many times did we land? How many men have been on the moon?
So we landed, the United States landed 6 times successfully, so that means 12 people have walked on the lunar surface.
And all men?
All men, yes.
So, but we are planning on going back in 2026.
Yes, so with the Artemis program, there's plans to land humans on the moon for the first time since 1972, which was the last Apollo mission.
The last time anyone's been on the moon, 1972.
Yes, the end of 1972. And at the National Air and Space Museum, we actually have their overshoe boots that made the last human footprints on the lunar surface. It's sort of remarkable to see, and I was able to show those boots to the Artemis 2 crew, they have a mission plan for the spring of 2026, and they were thinking about could we have Artemis boots here on exhibit someday? But it had been a number of decades. There were 2 other presidential initiatives that tried to send humans to the moon, but those were changed and canceled with changes in administration. And so the Artemis program is the first time you get the sustained sort of political will and interest in lunar exploration since the Apollo program.
Well, let's hear from the Artemis astronauts.
Apollo 8, when they flew around the moon just before Christmas in 1968, there was a lot going on in the world, and people realized it was a really tough time. People were struggling in many different ways, and I think we can all resonate with that today. And I remember reading about a postcard that Bill Anders got when he got back, and it just simply said, all that was written on it was, "You saved 1968."
And I do think about those Apollo astronauts. We've seen them many times in those press conferences. We've read their books. And they were really mission focused. They went through the training that the team put before them. They worked with the teams. They stayed up late. They studied because they cared about giving the most back that they possibly could. And that is what we share with them that I'm so proud and honored to share. NASA is so revered for that history. And I also want it to be revered for its future, for the future that we are bringing to humanity in doing this mission.
So part of the plan for the Artemis program is to land a woman and a person of color for the first time on the lunar surface. So with the Artemis 3 mission, that's part of the plan. It's still a little ways off. So the next Artemis mission, Artemis 2, will be a flyby mission. So they won't actually land coming up in 2026, but they will go to the area of the moon. And like you see with the Apollo program, there are all these different missions that build on each other, that prepare for the landing mission. So you see that also with the Artemis program. So this crew will not land, but they'll go to the region of the moon for the first time since 1972, and then prepare for Artemis 3, which will be the first landing mission.
Can you draw a direct line from Apollo to Artemis?
There are so many connections between the two programs, and then there are very important differences. One of the things that I love as the curator of the Apollo collection is we have a research collection. We are a resource for people working on the Artemis program, and I get calls from NASA and from industry trying to learn from Apollo hardware. So if you think about, testing and how important testing is, the Apollo artifacts are great examples of what happens to material if you send it to the moon, or how you land on the lunar surface. The lunar module can tell you a lot about that. And so I get to work with people on the Artemis program who are learning lessons from Apollo hardware experiences. But some of the differences also, as you mentioned, so women are involved in the program, that's a difference. But also the Artemis program sort of has a vision of sustained life on the lunar surface. So the Apollo program sometimes is referred to as flags and footprints. So the missions were relatively short. The longest ones were spending 3 days on the lunar surface. Neil Armstrong's moonwalk was about 2.5 hours long, so relatively short. So the Artemis program, what it hopes to do is help contribute to a sustained human presence on the moon, a lunar economy, really thinking about living and working in space in a new way.
Now, Teasel Muir-Harmony, we have jumped ahead 50 years from Apollo to Artemis, but between that time, there was Skylab, the space shuttle program, International Space Station, cooperation with the Soviet Union. What are we missing here in our history of spaceflight?
When it comes to human spaceflight, there's been a lot of work done living in low Earth orbit. So you have the Skylab program, which is the first American space station program that happened using Apollo hardware. And there were 3 missions in 1973 where the United States really learned quite a lot about what it would mean to live and work in space. Really important scientific research done both on the human body as well as on remote sensing and on heliophysics. So really important to that. The shuttle program also, and tied also with the International Space Station, a lot of lessons learned about long duration spaceflight. How do you live and work successfully in outer space? And I like to emphasize, especially because we just passed the 25th anniversary of sustained presence in outer space. So humans have been living on the International Space Station since 2000. So it's been 25 years.
Continually.
Continually, yes. And the amount of information gathered from that experience is extraordinary and will really contribute to then future human spaceflight and exploration.
A lot of international cooperation at the space station, correct?
Yes. So the space station is the largest scale example of an international cooperative program, not just in space, but I believe in STEM in general. It's the program investment is about $150 billion, and you see the United States and Russia, European Space Agency, Japan and Canada coming together to build the space station and then to live and work on the space station as well.
China and their space program, how advanced?
China has been making really steady progress in their space program. They have a space station in Earth orbit. They've
separate from the International Space Station, correct?
Yes, separate from the International Space Station. Within the United States, the United States has a lot of restrictions on cooperating with China in space. So that's part of the reason they're not part of the International Space Station, but made great strides in terms of sending humans into outer space and robotic exploration of the moon as well, going to the lunar far side, going to the South Pole.
Now, Teasel Muir-Harmony, we've also landed on Mars, haven't we?
Yes. Actually, we're coming up on the 50th anniversary of the United States landing on Mars, which I hope people will celebrate. The Viking program from 1976. It was sort of celebrated as part of the United States' bicentennial celebration. So it happened in July of 1976, but there were 2 Viking landers that landed successfully on the Martian surface.
What's your PhD in?
The history of science and technology.
Did you want to be an astronaut?
No, I actually love the history of space exploration, and from the start, I wanted to study the history of efforts to understand our universe and efforts to explore it as well.
Teasel Muir-Harmony is the curator of the National Air and Space Museum's Apollo collection. We really appreciate your spending some time with us here on C-SPAN to talk about the history of U.S. spaceflight. Thank you. Thanks for joining us on the Q&A podcast. Next week, we talk with the head of the White House Historical Association about what else? The White House.